This week's lecture is about power and politics. So again, subjects that are studied by many kinds of scholars. In this case, we're going to talk about some of the things that cultural anthropologists have learned from the perspective of this field. So one of the key distinctions that your book makes is between power and authority. So I thought I'd start there. When we talk about politics, we're always talking about an exercise of power. But there are nuances to how that takes place. So one distinction that your book makes is between power as the use of force, right? So in other words, sort of making people do stuff, versus authority. So persuading people to do things. So authority is something that can be vested in certain processes or certain people, right? Certain political figures whose authority is recognized, and therefore people are willing to either do what they mandate or follow their lead, so to speak. Whether power takes the form of force or persuasion, there is the related issue of legitimacy. Right? So, in other words, for it to be an effective exercise of power, then people need to recognize it as legitimate, right? As something that those wielding power have the right to control and deploy. So, in other words, the exercise of power is not always accepted, right? There are cases in which the exercise of power is resisted, right, or rejected altogether. So legitimacy is part of what makes it possible for the powers that be, whatever form they may take, to either force or persuade others to do things. Now, I want to touch a little bit on another set of categories that the book talks about. And these are long-standing sort of ways of describing different political systems. And I put a sort of a disclaimer at the top here. I want to introduce these. I think they're useful as a sort of a device or a tool for thinking comparatively about different kinds of political organization. But I also think that there are all kinds of things that are sort of problematic about this schematic of the four kinds of political entities. I think it's dated, and I think it's got some limitations, and I think it sort of reduces certain complexities. But let's use it again as a heuristic device, as something that we can employ as a tool to help us compare, even if we know that it's actually quite a bit more complicated than that. One of the key ways in which I think it's more complicated than that is that all of these different kinds of political organization at this point in human history are integrated into nation states, right? So I'm talking about bands as if they exist outside of or alongside states is not terribly useful. So there are indeed still band organized groups of people, right? A band being a small, informal, typically egalitarian way of social organization. But those bands are also sort of under the umbrella of a state. A tribe, which is the second sort of type of political organization that the book alludes to, is something that's typically bigger and a bit more complicated in its organization than the band. So the tribe is segmentary. It's integrated by a number of mechanisms that you read about in the book, including things like age grades, which is where all the people of a similar age bracket are sort of organized into a group, and they do certain things together or play certain roles in society together. Things like marriage, particularly as marriage integrates different families or different lineages, right? You read about, for example, ways in which in certain societies it's common to marry the cousin of another lineage, right? So there's all kinds of ways in which family organization and political organization overlap and intersect. This kind of political organization also relies on things like gift exchange, right, which we also talked about in the past, where things like reciprocity, which we've talked about, can be a way to forge different kinds of power-laden relationships. Okay. The third variety of political organization that the book alludes to is what's referred to as a chiefdom. So this is more hierarchical than the other two, right? Tends to be a ranked society under a ruler, right? Someone understood to be a chief or a leader, right? But that there's, again, more hierarchy than we'd find in the other two categories. And then finally, a state, which is the sort of form of political organization that most of us are most familiar with, right? Given that the modern nation state is the dominant political organization on the planet and has been for some time, right? So there are, again, these other ways of organizing oneself that are, smaller subsections of states, but the state system is certainly the dominant one. And a state is a centralized political system, and it claims control of certain kinds of processes, including things like being the only legitimate use of force, and states are quite hierarchical or stratified. We'll talk a little bit more about states or nation states in a few minutes. So one of the things that is useful about comparing these different kinds of political organization is it can help you think about different aspects of political entities, including things like, for example, varieties of leadership. That is, how different groups of people vest power in certain individuals to be leaders or guides. And we find that the nature of the leaders in these different kinds of political organizations is quite different, right? So, for example, if we wanted to compare the informal power of the leaders who are known as big men, for example, this man on the left, who is a big man, that is an informal political leader in Papua New Guinea, versus the formal power of someone like, the President of the United States, we'll find all kinds of differences. So the kind of system we have in the U.S., the political leaders that we vest power in are in a position to make the citizens of the country do all kinds of things, right? There's a different kind of power there. Informal leaders like the big man on the left can try to convince people, right, and encourage them to do things, but ultimately does not have any formal mechanism to make people do things. As I mentioned, the nation-state system is the dominant one, and I think it's worth reflecting a little bit on this sort of political organization that we tend to take for granted. The fact of the matter is that the modern nation-state system, although certainly dominant in the world, is a relatively recent invention. It emerged only in the 17th century. So this is not a timeless way of organizing societies, right? It has a very particular history. It's not a terribly deep history. Despite that, we tend to take it for granted. I mean, even looking at a map like this one, which is a typical way that maps are presented, with these different colors and these very well-defined lines between where one nation-state ends and a new one begins. Again, it's something that we see all the time, and we assume it to be sort of just the way things are. The fact is we need to think about both where this came from, again, just several centuries ago, and the fact that in our current world there are all kinds of challenges to this system. What we'll be talking about next week is globalization, which includes various challenges to our assumptions about nation states, right? There are various political entities in the world that in fact cut across those borders and connect those territories in ways that are not well represented in this kind of a map. But the fact is we want to think about nation states because, again, it has a lot of both real and symbolic power in the world today. So if we think about states and how they operate and how they wield power, we can think about a few different kinds of control that states have. I already mentioned one, which is that states claim a monopoly on legitimized force. That is, the state is the only actor that can, have the right to deploy force. That can take the form of military, as in this image here, or at a smaller level, police forces and things like that. But the notion is that the state has the right to deploy force. and everyday citizens do not. The state also claims the right to demand resources from citizens. The most obvious way is in paying taxes, things like that, or paying fees and fines. The way that the state is able to fund many of its functions is through, again, claiming that right to demand that citizens contribute funds to the running of the state. The state also controls who is deemed to be a citizen and what is deemed to be the territory that that state controls. And we see this through the system of immigration policies, the defining and buttressing of borders, the assigning of citizenship status, right? So states, again, claim this right to decide who is or isn't a citizen and what is or isn't the territory that that state controls. And finally, we can also note that states control information. So what the citizens can know about how the state operates. States tend to have, systems for revealing some things and not revealing others. The United States is the same, right, in having certain kinds of information that are considered classified, and only people at certain levels of the hierarchy of the state are allowed to know those things. So what all of this suggests is that the nation state is a certain sort of political organization, and it rests on a whole bunch of assumptions about the nature of legitimate power. Those are otherwise, another way of talking about those assumptions is that they are ideologies, right? These are ideas about the sort of legitimacy of the state system, and that the legitimacy and the sort of accepting of that legitimacy by citizens allows it to continue to operate in that way. One of the ways that those ideologies continue to saturate our consciousness about the political organization that we're embedded in is that that kind of power is exercised in both practical and symbolic ways. So some of the practical ways we can think about, all of the ways listed on this slide here, all the ways that the state sort of reaches into all of our everyday lives, right, by things like expecting us to pay taxes by a certain date, or to register our cars, or pay a red light ticket if we are fined in that way, etc., right? But there's also all kinds of symbolic ways that back up those practical functions of the state, right? So we can think about all the different symbols of state power that are in circulation and how they affect our consciousness. Some of these are quite obvious, some of them are a little bit less obvious, but something like a flag, of course, is perhaps the symbol par excellence of the nation state, right? But there's all kinds of smaller everyday symbols that we in fact often carry on our persons. Something like money, right? The currency of a particular state. Identification, a passport or a license or whatever it may be. Some of the kinds of symbols that nation states traffic in are sort of take the form that is, the form of the symbol is as important as the content of the symbol. So, for example, monumental architecture, stuff like the Washington and Lincoln Memorial, the Capitol building, we find in states throughout the world over time that big, heavy, imposing architecture is often used as a symbol of state power, right? Because precisely that form that it takes, that it looms over you, that it looks permanent, it's made out of stone, it's not going anywhere, carries with it all of those sort of meanings or implications about the power of that political organization. We already alluded to the fact that the state claims a monopoly on legitimate use of force, and around the military or police forces, we find also lots of sort of use of symbols, whether it's in uniforms or badges or various kinds of military displays, right? Certainly some of that is functional, but some of it is also symbolic. And that's the point that I'm making here, is that the way that the state exerts its power weds the practical and the symbolic. While we're talking about politics, I also want to take a minute to talk a little bit about the book you've been reading, Labor and Legality. And we'll talk about it more next week, too, because it also ties in very well with the theme or the subject of globalization. This is a really interesting book, I think, not only because it's set in and around Chicago, but because it's also about a very pressing current issue in the world today, which is immigration, and particularly the experiences of undocumented immigrants in the United States. We know this is an issue that has been deeply politicized in the U.S. in recent years. And this book, Labor and Legality, takes a somewhat unusual approach to it in that it's an ethnography of undocumented workers in the U.S., right? We're more likely to hear discussions of immigration by legal scholars or political scientists. But this particular author, Ruth Gomberg Munoz, is an anthropologist. So she did the kind of research that anthropologists do, in that she really sort of engaged in interviews and participant observation and really getting to know the individual men that she was interested in learning about to really understand the details of their everyday lives. So her book then, as by now I think you know, since you're probably pretty well into reading it, is about it's about the whole phenomenon of undocumented workers in the U.S., but she looks at that bigger issue through the lens of the lives of 10 particular undocumented Mexican men who are working as busboys around Chicago. So I wanted to just pull out a few key themes as you're reading that, continuing to read that book, and particularly as you're starting to think about the book review to sort of process what you've read around some key themes. So I wanted to pull out a few of those themes today, and then again in the lecture next week I'll talk about it a bit more. But I think these are some important things that the author brings up. One of the main goals that I think the book has, and the author says as much, is really to challenge what are a lot of misconceptions and stereotypes about undocumented people in the U.S., and maybe particularly about people coming from Mexico, right, as our neighbor country that we share a border with. Again, as I'm sure you're all aware, this has been a highly politicized issue, and that has led to a lot of misinformation about who these individuals are, why they're here, etc. In the beginning of the book, Gomberg Munoz talks a lot about the fact that indeed this is not a new thing, that there's a long history of the economies of the United States and Mexico being interconnected in a variety of ways. And that has included a long history of Mexican workers working in the United States, including a longstanding program, the Bracero program, that invited and encouraged Mexican laborers to work in the United States. So the notion that there's something new happening in terms of people coming to the U.S. to work is simply inaccurate. So Munoz is really, or Gomberg Munoz is really trying to get beyond that sort of political rhetoric that would frame what's going on here in ways that are really about contemporary politics, not about the actual history. So to do that, she really focuses in on these individuals and providing their biographies and their own narratives, right? I'm sure you've noticed that she includes fairly lengthy sort of personal statements from each of the men, so you sort of hear their voices talking about their experiences as a way to get at the human side of what this immigration issue rests on. So, because she's really interested in people immigrating into the United States for the sake of work, she starts with and spends a lot of time talking about the work lives of these men, right? And there's some very interesting sort of information that comes out about their work as busboys, right, in restaurants in suburban Chicagoland. One is the role of hard work, right? And as she points out, these men have sort of a reputation for being really excellent at their jobs, right? Working very hard, being very diligent, being very sort of people that can be trusted to do what is expected of them. And she talks about that as being sort of a double-edged sword for these men. It's actually a stereotype, right? And in some ways, the men sort of play up that stereotype because it is good for them in certain ways, in that it becomes a source of job security. It also means that their bosses can trust them and therefore give them a bit more autonomy in their work, right? And it also allows them to claim some dignity for what they do, right? But it also means that they, again, sometimes are characterized as being inherently hard workers, right? As if there's something natural about them, or that there's something about their ethnicity that makes them just naturally want to work very hard, which of course is not true, right? In fact, as she describes, the men who have these jobs work hard to socialize other workers to do this hard work, right? To take on this role. It doesn't come naturally. It's something that people have to really work at. So again, there's sort of there's reasons for these for the Lyons to want to play into that stereotype, but it also ends up sort of racializing the work. So as she points out, these restaurants tend to have white employees working in the, quote, front of the house, and Mexican or other immigrant workers working in the back of the house, right? And that racialization also means that although the Lyons are understood and are respected for being very hard workers, there's a certain degree to which their job prospects are very limited, right? They are not being offered some of the higher paying, for example, server jobs. So again, a double-edged sword. The author also talks a lot about the Lyons' social relationships, both with one another and with others. And so there's a lot about how important their social networks are. And these are both social networks of family members, people they're related to, and friends. So the Lyons and others who are doing this kind of lower paid service work in the U.S., really pool their resources. As you read, they support one another both in crossing the border and then in finding and keeping jobs and in maintaining reasonable living conditions. So, for example, sharing houses, sharing bills, sharing food. So all of those things are very much a part of this experience of being undocumented workers in the U.S., is that sort of social, that solidarity that they show for one another that allows them to have decent living conditions and a decent experience. But the social networks of the Lyons and other undocumented workers in the U.S. extend beyond just the workers who are on this side of the border. As she notes, there's actually broad, wide social networks that stretch between Mexico and the U.S. So these men are also, of course, maintaining connections to family back home in Mexico. Some of them, for example, have wives and children on the other side of the border. And some are going back and forth, right? That, as she points out, is much harder to do now as the militarization of the border has increased. It's harder to be sort of, go back and forth seasonally. But at a minimum, the men she's worked with maintain those connections and send money back, right? And indeed, the money they're able to send back often makes a significant difference in the livelihood of family members back home, right? So remittances is the term often used for that money that people send back to their home countries. And in fact, it amounts to a massive amount of money, right? Overall, it's a significant part of the economy, in fact, is the money being sent back from workers who are abroad. And then the final theme I just wanted to touch on, which, again, we'll also talk about a bit next week, is all of the various ways in which the experiences of the men in this book speak to these broader issues of immigration and immigration policy in the United States. And again, her goal in the way she writes about these issues is sort of to debunk a lot of misconceptions and a lot of misinformation about labor migration. She points out that migration is not just about individuals wanting to cross the border. That in fact, the entire sort of political economy of globalization almost inevitably leads to people migrating for work. And she goes back historically and talks about, for example, policies, particularly starting in the 1980s, with free trade agreements and the sort of encouragement of the free market that, again, really pushed people to move for work. So that those sort of economic policies, political and economic policies that encouraged labor migration were matched with a simultaneous crackdown on people crossing borders, right? And that militarization of the U.S.-Mexico border and the restriction of the rights of migrants. So we have this sort of this deeply conflicted set of principles, right? One which encourages people to move and another which punishes them when they do so. Another element of sort of challenging and debunking some of the assumptions that people have around particularly undocumented immigrants in the U.S. is the idea that they're somehow a drain on the U.S. economy. Quite the contrary. As she points out, undocumented immigrants in the U.S. contribute billions of dollars to the U.S. economy through all the different kinds of taxes that they contribute, right? Even though they are not eligible for most government services. So these are individuals who are giving a lot more monetarily to the U.S. than they get. And she also points out, another key sort of stereotype, which is the idea that undocumented immigrants are somehow a source of crime or violence. Quite the contrary, as she points out and has been very well documented. Immigrants in the U.S. Commit crimes at a significantly lower rate than U.S. citizens do. So that's simply not true. So overall, one of her points is to encourage us as the readers to think more critically about this kind of human movement, which has been a part of the human story from its very beginnings. There's nothing inherently illegal about people migrating from one place to another, right? Again, at different moments in history, it has or hasn't been considered a problem, and it has or hasn't been considered, quote unquote, illegal. So there's nothing inherently problematic about people moving from one place to another. It's simply that laws that have been inserted at some moments in time have restricted movement. So if we want to understand what's going on with people moving from one part of the world to another, we need to think in that way about the social context of laws, not assume illegality to begin with. So again, this is just a little bit of a recapping of some of the key themes from this text. I hope you'll keep reading it. It's, I think, a very interesting book and quite readable. So we'll talk a bit more about it in next week's lecture as well. Have a great rest of the week, and we'll talk soon. Bye-bye.